your bio indicated that you have served in Jamaica in the 1980s during the JFK administration.
That's correct.
Could you compare that period and now?
Well, the world was very different. And the issues of the middle 80s, of course, were dominated by the continuing Cold War and the global ideological competition, which had manifestations here in terms of the political philosophies of the two parties. Jamaica was also still coming out of a very difficult period from the 1980 elections, and the issues around those elections and some of the violence and disruptions were still resonating in the atmosphere then. Also, in the middle 1980s, we were beginning to see the emergence of this hemispheric narcotics trafficking and the impact it was having on increased gun violence and trafficker gangs and posses that were moving into the United States, which was a significant bilateral issue at the time. As well as you had a transition that was taking place in the hemisphere, as well as in Africa and other developing countries, where the movement towards more representative systems was beginning to manifest. You can even think about Latin America and other parts of the non-English speaking Caribbean. A good image I like to think of when I want to remember these times is the meetings of the heads of state of the Western Hemisphere. In the Eisenhower administration, you see the picture, and most of the Latin American representatives are in uniform. They're generals with all the military regalia. When President Nixon met with them almost 20 years later, maybe only half of them were in uniform. By the 90s, none of them were in uniform. So this was beginning to affect how the region interacts with itself, as well as how the hemisphere conditioned diplomatic and international relations in the hemisphere. Now we're in the end of the Cold War. Cold War's done. A few years after I left. I left in '87 and went to Caracas. This was before the Chavez regime. Carlos Andres Perez and Carlos Osenchi. Osenchi was actually president when I was in Venezuela. And you see that there's been a significant change in regional relations. This was before the New Jewel movement in Grenada. Well, it was after the New Jewel movement in Grenada. It was '83. '83. That's right. And I went on to Barbados, and a lot of the post-intervention politics of the Eastern Caribbean were so dominant at that time. And moving from the Caribbean in '97 to Africa, Southern Africa, saw a lot of the similar kinds of challenges in terms of political transformation, dealing with the challenges of development, trying to bring the majority of the populations in the post-colonial context into the mainstream of the economy. Same kind of challenges that Jamaica was going through when I was here in the years before. So coming back in this post-Cold War environment now, almost 2 decades after the fall of the wall, and seeing the grappling of societies with how to interact with the pressure of globalism and the effect that that's had on governance and political philosophy, I was keen to see in Jamaica, when I arrived, the degree to which the parties have come toward a closer consensus on what pragmatic governance philosophies call for Jamaica.
The political parties.
Yes. And I think that there has been a kind of a closing of the gap in terms of governing philosophies and the kind of challenges that Jamaica faces, particularly in the economic area, that affects everything else. The conversation is about the same issues, and the solutions are within a significant range, much closer together, and how governments are approaching them are also much more consensus-based. Of course, solutions are always difficult, and the leadership is different. I think Peter Phillips, the Minister of Finance, who comes out of an academic experience, but was associated with the political developments at the time, now has to lead the governance group that has to deal with these financial and monetary challenges and trade challenges. And I think that the kind of pragmatic approaches that are becoming patterns around the world are beginning to manifest in governance here in Jamaica as well. So the distance and the variance in the political ideologies that I saw when I was here have moved closer toward the center, and there's a emerging governing consensus that didn't exist at the time.
Is that convergence of governance
Ideology.
Yes, ideology. Basically, is that something that the United States is comfortable with?
Yes. Fundamentally, we are interested in seeing Jamaica find solutions to these issues that will benefit the majority of the Jamaican people, that will lead to stability and growth, that will bring people into the productive economy, that will allow for revenues to be generated that can be applied to the necessities of development, to education and agricultural development and food security, environmental protections and the like. So the so-called Washington consensus that the multilateral organizations, and particularly in the financial area, evolved about 25 years ago, that still has a significant influence on international financial trade and monetary relationships. This convergence of political philosophy in Jamaica as it regards pragmatic governance is beginning to be of a tone that better engages this global framework. And of course, that's a better thing.
Another one?
Yes, but emanating from that period, as you alluded a short while ago, we had the whole narcotic issue, major challenge. Then you have the extradition treaties that emerged in 1991, I think it was. Is the United States comfortable with this state of the extradition treaty between Jamaica and U.S. now?
Well, you have to keep remembering something, and let me characterize the case a little differently than you did. There have been extradition treaties on a bilateral basis affecting relations between the U.S. and Jamaica that go back even beyond the independence period. And the post-independence period, there have been a pattern of practice that has allowed for the extradition of criminal suspects and persons of interest by both governments. And within the framework of our mutual legal assistance treaties and our mutual concern about managing the challenges of particularly violent crime and the extent to which violent crime is associated with the narcotics trafficking framework, we've had good practice over the long term in that regard. I would think that in specific answer to your question, is the U.S. satisfied with the relationships we have with our mutual legal assistance and treaty-based relationships as regards the mutual obligations and patterns of practice for the treatment of violent criminals? In general terms, yes. Most of these events take place without ever getting into the news. They become almost procedural, and they've been in place for a long time.
You have some expertise in I almost said national security issues.
Yes, I do.
Is there more that can be done between the U.S., the Caribbean certainly, and the U.S. in terms of protecting our borders? And what, if you feel that there's more that can be done, what are some of the steps that you would recommend?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that from my point of view that security is a collective issue. It is not unique to any one political jurisdiction. The nature of contemporary crime is transnational in scope, and as a result, it requires international coordination. The Caribbean, as a particular political unit, is particularly vulnerable to the transnational nature of modern crime. And the pressures for cooperation within the Caribbean, the sharing of intelligence, the tracking of guys that are bad that affect you all, the movement of certain patterns of criminal enterprise that affect the region, really does, to me, suggest a compelling need for a much more cohesive regional response, a harmonization of regional policy, a cooperation of regional law enforcement and national security agencies in a way that deal with these issues that are beyond the capacity of any one country. Now, when I was here 27 years ago, I was a part of the team that was promoting a lot of these kinds of activities. Mm-hmm. You saw the emergence of the Caribbean Chiefs of Police Conference, which now is routine. Nobody ever talks about it anymore. It wasn't routine before. Yeah. You begin to see the coordination among police forces and national intelligence units tracking criminal enterprises and organized crime to meet periodically and share information in ways that wasn't taking place in the first decade and a half of the independence period, first 2 decades of the independence period. The new types of crime that emerged, in many cases, there was insufficient national statute to effectively prosecute these kinds of crimes. So it called for a harmonization of national security law around the region so that criminals couldn't pick and choose their places of operation in ways that made them relatively impervious to law enforcement and effective prosecution. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. government has been involved in supporting and advocating for these kinds of movements for this whole time and continue to do so.
You're on the eve of a presidential election at a time when the world, and the United States in particular, is in the throes of some kind of economic crisis. Do you foresee the foreign policy of the United States changing in any significant way in the aftermath of the November elections?
That's a very good question. And I'll start by quoting a very famous American politician on American politics, a former Speaker of the House from Massachusetts by the name of Tip O'Neill. His famous quote, which was quite apt at the time and still today, is that in America, all politics are local. So you can see in the 2 campaigns, and now, since Jimmy Carter, our campaigns last for 2 to 3 years. Yeah. The real campaign is beginning now. But you've seen the primaries and the like over the last year and a half. I would suggest that in all of the issues that have been debated by both parties with their basis in their constituencies and the primaries and even up to the conventions, that there have not been a great deal of focus on foreign affairs. Yeah. And that's because it's a constituency-driven system where local constituency interests drive the focus of our politicians. As a result of that aspect of our politics, there is a historical consensus that to a significant degree, the president has unique constitutional authority to make foreign policy and to implement it, and the unique authority to sign treaties and negotiate them. As a result, you've seen, let's call it in the relatively modern period since World War II, a significant consensus by both parties on matters of national security and foreign policy. There are some jiggering along the edges, but the core foreign policy of the United States has maintained a certain continuity across policies. That was particularly true in the Cold War, but has been also true in the post-Cold War period. Now, you'll see on certain issues as regards immigration, though, both parties agree that it's important to protect our borders, and both parties agree that there has to be a rule-based system for movement of persons. There's some difference in degree, but there's fundamental agreement on that. In terms of major national security issues, there's not a great deal of disagreement. Now, in some cases, you'll have aspects of foreign policy that some would say pander to local constituency interests, and one that has appeared in both of the conventions, for example, is where should the capital of Israel be. Now, our foreign policy is very different than public debate. Public debate, all views contend, and you have a wide range of discussions. But when you look at the policy, there's a great continuity. Since the recognition of Israel by the Truman administration and the issues as it regards where the capital of Israel should be, U.S. foreign policy has not wavered. And that is, it's for the parties to determine. And certain claims that Jerusalem should be the capital are recognized and appreciated. But where is our embassy? It's in Tel Aviv. And that's been our policy for the last 55, 60 years. And so you'll see that there's a wide debate where all ideas contend. But when you want to see what the policy is, look at practice, not debate.
Okay. I wanted to keep you on the international scene. Your bio told us that you served in South Africa.
I did.
Can you give me your reaction to what happened there recently?
I mean, the miners?
The miners and first the shooting of the miners, and then the decision by the government, which it eventually reversed, or the state prosecutor.
I mean, the declaration that some of the miners were guilty of murder?
Exactly, yes.
Well, first of all, I'm not accredited to South Africa. And to say that I'm not speaking as an American diplomat is pointless. But I have background in South Africa that precedes my diplomatic career. My first visit to South Africa, in fact, was during the apartheid years in 1982. And I served in Lesotho when, from 97 to 2000, at the last couple of years of the Mandela administration. And throughout the years since then, I think I've been back in South Africa almost every year since 2000 for one reason or another. And in the last 3 years, I made at least 5 trips to South Africa. So I have a broad perspective on the region and on the issues in South Africa, which are, as you can imagine, very complex. South Africa had the great challenge in 1994 of creating a system that diverged from the 200 years before of the apartheid regime, of apartheid-like and colonial regimes. At 1994, the economy of South Africa was designed for 20% of the population. And the vast majority of South Africans were not even recognized as citizens before 1994. The challenge of building an economy, growing an economy, to accommodate all of the citizens of South Africa is a multi-generational challenge. But of course, people want things now. And it's very difficult for governments with their limited budgets and the vicissitudes of the international economy to be able to accommodate them. Just like in Jamaica and much of the British colonial world, the nascent origins of the political parties are associated with trade union movements. Okay, that's absolutely true in the case of South Africa. Even today, you look at the coalition ruling South Africa, COSATU, the major trade union confederation, and the Communist Party, with the African National Congress, forms the ruling coalition. So trade union issues and the interests of workers who are in the commanding heights aspects of the economy, and in South Africa, natural resources and commodities trade is their #1 source of foreign exchange. Mining is a significant political issue, and the interests of miners as well. South Africa, unfortunately, has a political tradition where violence and politics are associated. And, you know, South Africa and Jamaica have similar characteristics as it regards violence, crime, murder. They have a higher incidence of rape than you do in Jamaica. But it's a structural problem that predates 94. Trade union demonstrations before 1994 and after 1994 have tended to be violent. And you saw the images of the miners. Mm-hmm. Some of them actually had weapons, but most of the things that they had, the machetes and the knob carries, there's a weird thing in South African law that doesn't describe those as weapons. They describe them as cultural implements. Mm-hmm. That's a unique feature of their particular history. But they're used as weapons, and they're perceived as weapons. Mm-hmm. And so you have this conflict in a passionate situation where people are demonstrating for their own self-interests, and the responsibilities of law enforcement to maintain a certain level of acknowledgement of the law and relative peace. But you have a passionate environment where competing trade unions, in this case, fought against each other in the preceding weeks. Mm-hmm. You know that?
Yeah.
And that several deaths were associated with that competition among trade unions. It had nothing to do with the police. It was a inter-trade union squabble over primacy over these mines.
Yeah.
This got out of hand. I'm sympathetic on one level to the challenges faced by the police of South Africa in this matter. But no one could support or validate the... You saw the film?
Yeah.
I saw the film. And about 20 seconds of gunfire with R5s, no one can support that. Of course, it put the ANC in a crisis. And you know the Youth League and the party are having some significant disagreements over the expelling of Julius Malema. Mm-hmm. And you saw immediately he denounced Zuma. Mm-hmm. This has become, we've got an election coming up in the next year. Party conferences that took place the month before. This all is now added to the fufra in the political world because the trade unions, in effect, were positioning themselves to influence the party's policies. It just got out of hand. I think it was a terrible thing. It's unfortunately has happened many times in South Africa. Not this level, much smaller levels. Not this many people dying in one incident, but cumulatively it's more. This is another one of the challenges South Africa is facing. You know, the propensity for violence in South Africa is ancient, and it predates the independence period by a significant degree. They have a structural problem that is going to be very hard for them to solve. They have a passionate level of politics and a significant association with violence that is historical. And the politics of South Africa are going to have to grapple with this for a very long time.
Yes. As it relates to human trafficking, any significant changes over the last few years?
The patterns?
Jamaica was being targeted, was accused some years ago of not doing enough. What's the state of affairs as it relates to human trafficking and Jamaica?
Well, first of all, let's recall that this is a global policy development, and it's a global problem. And as a country that respects multilateralism, Jamaica is a signatory to the appropriate treaties and agreements as regards this matter. To the degree to which Jamaica is able to put in place the right kind of legislation that adequately criminalizes this activity, the degree to which Jamaica actively prosecutes persons who comes into contact with law enforcement that have been involved in this activity, and the degree to which Jamaica is able to put in place ameliorative system and responses to protect the victims of this activity, Jamaica comes into the international consensus. Now, sometimes it just takes long to do stuff bureaucratically in passing legislation, getting consensus among the parliamentarians and the parties to find the budget to put in place these things that would protect the victims and the changes in law that would adequately allow for the effective prosecution of the perpetrators. Jamaica has made positive representations in those directions. their realization of those intentions has been slower than I think Jamaicans would want. Our position is trying to help Jamaica move in that direction. But we have certain domestic responsibilities and requirements that are associated with our adherence to these multilateral agreements. And within the framework of our trafficking in persons legislation, our Congress requires us to report on the performance of other states. And as a part of the positive and negative disincentives that you find in diplomacy, we have a system of categorizing the levels of performance of states. And based on the expressed representations of our bilateral partners, the expectation is built up that a certain level of action will occur within a reasonable period of time. And when performance falls short of expectations, particularly based on expressed intention, we're compelled to report that within our system. And within our system, lack of fulfillment of expressed intentions towards these multilateral standards requires us to put them on a spectrum of performance. And in this case, there's been not as great a movement as in some particulars as we would have liked to have seen. And within the framework of our own domestic law, we're required to report that. And that's what we have done in this case.
I take it to Venezuela, Mr. Chavez. He's, as we know, in an election campaign now. But he has been basically pushing to form this new group of Caribbean countries, Caribbean and Latin American group of countries. If my memory serves me right, I don't think Jamaica is a member of that group, but certainly we have not had an indication from the government that they will not become a member of the group. Is given the state of the relationship between Venezuela and the U.S., what would be the response of the U.S. government to Jamaica embracing a group like that?
First, I'll state that I'm not accredited to Venezuela. And though I served in Venezuela, that was 25 years ago. And I've not served in the region in the last decade and a half. I've paid attention to Venezuela. I put it in the context of okay, first of all, I'll say this. Political evolution is never linear. Different factors affect its progression. And sometimes it moves in one direction, and sometimes it moves in another. In the 90s, you begin to see the ending of the caudillos, the great, strong dictators throughout Latin America. And you begin to see the emergence, in some cases, of radical revolutionary regimes. And then you saw a swing back towards more representative systems. In recent years, you've seen a swing back into the direction of the more radical, in some cases left, some cases right, regimes that are taking unique initiatives that are unique to the region. You can see what the Argentines are doing in terms of certain trade matters is considered relatively radical and revolutionary, but it's to the right. You see the elections in Bolivia and Ecuador and the return of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and it just reflects this. I'm not sure if you want to call it a swing from a pendulum effect. Humans don't accommodate mechanics very well, so I'm not sure you can call it a pendulum effect, but you see these various movements of direction of political evolution. Some of those directions are more comfortable to us than others. And some of those governments that emerged that put themselves in a position of opposition to U.S. policy in the United States, of course, are more uncomfortable for us. We continue to engage them. We've not terminated our diplomatic or trade relationships. We continue to engage them across a wide spectrum of activities. Some things we can support, some things we cannot. And we continue to engage with positive and negative disincentives, as all the tools you have in interstate relations, to move things in a direction that we can support. It depends. I don't know. This is the correct answer to something that hasn't happened, what the United States would do. But I, based on my experience, can say that positions that are taken by governments that are contrary to the global consensus and the international rules-making system that has emerged since World War II are more uncomfortable for us. And from your first question, you recall that the shifts in Jamaican politics in the 70s were very uncomfortable for us. The shifts in Jamaican politics to the current stage are more comfortable for us. And you never know where that's going to swing. But I can't answer a question of something that hasn't happened.